good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to yet another episode of Cryptonomy Talks. As you all know, at Cryptonomy Talks, we talk to the who's who are redefining the way the world economy works and how crypto economy plays a significant role in that side. Today we have somebody really special. We have Mr. Navin Gupta, who is the managing director with Ripple. Probably the most synonymous name and the most famous name in the cryptonomy world. There are three names if I have to pick up, it will be Ripple, Ethereum and Bitcoin. So Navin, welcome to the show Cryptonomy Talks. If you can tell us a bit about yourself and then we talk about the cryptonomy.
So Bhavin, first of all, a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think just very simply, I've been in Ripple for almost 5 years. And before that, I was building my own company, Uber for trucks in India. I mean, it was my own company. I exited that. And then before that, I worked 10 years at HSBC and almost 5 years at Citi in different markets around the world, in the US, in Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, Japan. And India, I used to be also on the board of National Payment Corporation of India. So I've got strong background in payments. And that's one of the big reasons that I joined Ripple as well.
Awesome. So banking to payments and then in the world of crypto.
That's correct.
So how has been this crypto journey in last 5 years? Because I think the economy itself on the crypto side has also significantly evolved. So how was it when you joined versus how do you see it today?
Yeah, so I think at least with Ripple and the way I see it is that for something to exist, it needs to create some fundamental value to its users, yes. Right? So unless I'm able to solve a problem for Bhavin and also not solve it in an incremental way, but in a step way, it will not work, right? Because I'll not be useful. And that's the reason, at least in my mind, it was very clear that payments is always a big use case, and particularly cross-border payments where everybody struggles. Bhavin sends money back to his family here from the UAE. He doesn't like the cost. He doesn't like the customer experience that he's having. Or sometimes if something goes wrong with the payment, he gets a call 3 days later, hey, something has gone wrong, right? So I truly believe in this idea that for e-commerce to flourish, for normal commerce to flourish, we need to have a significantly advanced payment system. And that's what Ripple's building. That's what I'm passionate about. So for me, in some way, it's not a change, right? So I was building it at Citibank. I was building it at HSBC or at National Payment Corporation of India, as you know. Yeah. And I'm building it here at Ripple. So we are still solving the payments use case. But of course, now with the help of Web3 or with the help of cryptos, we have been able to take a sledgehammer and essentially kind of really, truly made a big difference to it.
Awesome. And look, I think there has always been this challenge about utility of crypto assets versus perceived value,
True.
Right? And you seem to be working in this space which is genuinely increasing the utility part of it. But how do you see the perceived value side, right? Because clearly there's a lot of speculation in this market. There's a lot of perceived value. Some are qualified investors, some are not so qualified investors. So how do you see that market movement and how do you see that changing in coming years?
Yeah. So firstly, it's already changing, right? In some way, anything that doesn't have utility is finding harder to survive, right? So you're, of course, seeing that, and that's the reason you have, like you talked about, there is a tail end of number of crypto investments which are essentially not going anywhere because liquidity dried up or whatever thing has happened, right? The second thing that I truly believe is that you are seeing institutional adoption in some cases, right? So for example, in some of the platforms, institutions are coming in and say that we want to play. So that's again a sign of increased utility where you started with primarily retail users, retail consumers, but now institutions are essentially saying we want to play with it. Just to give an example, Nike buying Artifact, yep. which is I mean where they issued CloneX, which is one of the projects, is absolutely brilliant, right? So you can think of it as Nike as a conservative company relative to Artifact purely in the digital space, and they are coming together and saying let's create a new business model or a new experience for Bhavin that essentially did not exist before, right? So in my mind, these are the two things, right? The third thing that I would say is a lot of people, they don't grasp what would be something about crypto that makes it so special. So I'll give you one example, right? Crypto is one of the asset class that trades 24/7, right? 365 days, everywhere around the world, right? So what opportunity it essentially gives you that Bhavin's local currency is GBP and Mika-san's local currency is yen. Now there is a GBP to XRP trade that's happening 24/7, 365 days a year. There is a XRP to yen trade that's happening 24/7, 365 days a year. Hence, you are able to use the 24/7 infrastructure that already exists and be able to move value from two fiat
Correct.
starting point and then endpoints, right? So you're using crypto as a bridge, right? And this 24/7 trading ability allows you to do that. But whereas if you look at all the traditional systems, they have been said Monday to Friday, they only trade in local pairs, they're closed on Saturday to Sunday, and that's the reason it gives rise to settlement risk, pre-settlement risk, custody services, escrow services. So there is a huge plethora of intermediaries that exist primarily because markets are not 24/7. Now markets are 24/7, and hence you don't need all of them, and then a lot of business models, whether they're not possible earlier, are possible now. And that's the true advantage of crypto. And as entrepreneurs build on the top of this 24/7 infrastructure, you will see more and more use cases causing that step change in the user experience.
So, Navin, you brought a very important point, remittance, right? Both at an individual level, also as a corporate transfer.
True.
Middle East and MENA region by far is one of the biggest remittance market in the world, right? And equally so, we have countries in Africa and in Asia, which are perhaps the biggest receiver of the remittance.
True.
And there are a number of exchange houses that have been working on both sides, plus you have Western Unions of the world. How do you see that landscape evolving? Where exactly companies like yours will make a significant difference, and how it will evolve?
Yeah. So I think I'll speak about it in 2 points. So one, I would speak in terms of opportunity, right? So what's the opportunity, right? So Bhavin today goes in and he says, hey, you know what, I want to, he goes on wallstreetjournal.com, wsj.com, and then say, hey, I want to read an article, right? And the first message you essentially get is, Bhavin, you're not a subscriber, right? And if you want to read this article, you have to sign up for $60 a month, right?
Correct.
You have no choice, but you have to become a monthly subscriber to read just one article, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, what Wall Street Journal would like to do to say, hey, you know what, Bhavin, you want to read this article, just pay 10 cents and read it, right? So there are hundreds of millions of users who just want to read one article because the whole newspaper is not relevant to them, or economically they can't afford $60, but they are ready to sachetize or that one particular article and then read it or share it or whatever the case may be, right? Now, here's an opportunity for existing infrastructure providers to essentially say, for that one article, how we still make it efficient for 10 fills to get collected, right? And in some way, which means that the local systems will need to come to a cost where this can essentially be collected. Maybe it'll happen, for example, with XRP. Today, it could be able to do it. It can happen through CBDC. It can happen through some other form of crypto. But that opportunity exists because Wall Street Journal is saying, I'm losing hundreds of millions of dollars of sales, and you as a PSP, you as an institution, already have the distribution network, you're connected to all the payment systems to be able to collect the 10 fills on the behalf of Wall Street Journal. So this is the opportunity. I call it micropayments, but you can think about micropayments to say $100 or $200 is the normal amount of remittances, but below that, what happens to $75, what happens to $50, what happened to $25, what happened to $10. So that's the opportunity, right? The volume will go up, but the per unit price will come down. But like all things, you'll essentially make money on volume rather than every single transaction, right?
Cross-border microtransaction, 100%.
Absolutely.
Agree. And that obviously makes world much more a smaller place than a global thing. But what about pure remittance? Is there a play in the remittance, or remittance industry would continue as it is? Or somebody like you will act as the infrastructure or a backbone to what is today a very traditional way of remitting money?
Absolutely. So the latter, right? So firstly, we are the infrastructure layer which is essentially making it possible. So if you look at a remittance, why is remittance so expensive, right? There are two big reasons for remittance to be expensive, because otherwise it's just data, assuming that you're using an app and you're sending money to Navin where I have a bank account. So then it's just a movement of data from point A to point B, where ledgers are getting updated, your account is getting debited, my account is getting credited. And let's take a simplistic scenario where money is moving US dollar to US dollar for a minute, but it's moving cross border, right? So today we get charged a $40 or $50 fee, you sending the money, and maybe $30 to $40 on me receiving the money, right? So there is a large chunk of money that gets taken out, right? So to my mind, there are two things. So one, the reason it's so expensive is because of this something called as nostro account or working capital that the banks keep. Our estimate is that there is about $5 to $10 trillion of working capital that institutions keep around the world. Now the capital cost is passed to the users because the user essentially has to absorb that, right? Now with exactly the same example that I took earlier with a 24/7, 365 days trading infrastructure, you need to have zero nostro account balance, right? And that causes a step change in your cost as an institution to essentially say, hey, if my costs go down dramatically, I'm able to pass a significant portion of that saving to my customer so that they're able to increase their volume or my market share, right? So that's an opportunity that you have. The second opportunity that you have and where a large portion of cost lies is in rejects, in repairs, in a piece of information that's missing. So where, for example, we have something called as pre-validation. Even before a debit happens to your account, just the messaging goes to the receiving bank in Asia, in Africa, to say, hey, you know what, Bhavin wants to send money to person X. Can you have your machine learning algorithm look at that payment structure and essentially say whether it's acceptable or not, right? Awesome. They would look at it, they'll do the sanction check and come back to you and then say, hey, this payment is not acceptable, your amount has not been debited, and you essentially are told the last name is missing or whatever the case may be, right? Or the account number is wrong. Now it causes huge amount of ease to you. It essentially makes sure that the bank or the middle institution, the remitting institution, doesn't need to work with a reject, doesn't need to trace a payment and things like those, right? So if you solve for this, then you have essentially made again taken a sledgehammer and essentially reduced the cost dramatically, to which at which point the industry can grow at much higher rates, and that creates an opportunity for somebody to say, hey, I'll get greater market share and increase my volumes.
So let me be devil's advocate here, right? It's absolutely stunning to see that payment can move from one point to another point. In fact, the way I see it is that when the internet revolution happened, we had ability to transfer data and information from point A to point B. What crypto has done for us is ability to transfer value itself from point A to point B.
True.
And hence there is no net settlement and no need for nostro vostro.
True.
Now it sounds absolutely convincing.
True.
But what I still struggle is why is the adaptability rate of this so slow? It's been more than 5 or 6 years.
True.
Most governments doesn't seem to be receptive towards it, neither financial institution.
True.
And what surprises me the most is that even if you take a large multinational corporate which has to manage its own treasury function across 20 different countries, can potentially use your solution very easily.
True.
So what's holding everyone back?
Absolutely. So there are two things that are holding it back. So one is local currency pairs, right? Okay. So I'll give you an example, right? So maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago, when you will have $5 million XRP trading days, everybody would say that's brilliant, right? There is liquidity building up, but 5 million days, and now we have $4 billion trading days, right? So now what 4 billion essentially allows you to do is that you can disintermediate $4 billion worth of FX, just for example, by using XRP, similarly by Bitcoin, some other larger number, Ethereum, another larger number. But the FX markets are $4 to $6 trillion a day, right? So we are still scratching the surface in the overall orangutan size of the FX market. So, but it's moving at a rapid pace. So, so if you say, for example, the FX markets took, I don't know, 50 years to get to this point, definitely with cryptos it'll happen much quicker time.
What's that timeline, Navin? What are you thinking? I mean, at what point we will see that at least in the payment space, the crypto becomes the infrastructure for movement of value, or at least for the majority of the value transfer across the world? Are we talking 5 years, 10 years, or another 50 years?
I think to my mind 3 years, right? And it's the combination of two things. So it's a combination of players like us who are laying the infrastructure, laying the pipe, the sewage, the sewage, the plumbing and everything else. And then second, rise of stable coins, right? Because as the rise of stable coin happens, then you have this, and these could be government issued stable coins as well, then you have something issued by the government where the institutions are not worried about risk. I mean, people are essentially saying, hey, you know what, I'm comfortable with this way, right? Fine. And then you're suddenly able to see that government backed, it could be US dollar, it could be AD, it could be a number of other things, to essentially be used in a big way. So I think these two will cause a dramatic change. And in my mind, it's just 3 years away, not larger than that, because I also see it as a very big monkey see, monkey do market, right? I mean, think about it. A country A issues a stable coin that works brilliantly well. Bhavan will essentially say, I'll use this.
Yeah.
So the local currency issuer says, I need to match this up very, very quickly.
Right.
Otherwise, my customer Bhavan will essentially migrate to that stable coin that essentially he will use.
On that stable coin side, and that brings us to CBDC kind of a situation. So how many CBDCs? There are a number of people talking about it, but how many actually you see are close to the point at which they will become formal and official?
Yeah. So to my mind, I don't think we are far off, right?
Okay.
In 2 to 3 years time, one would, but also what is going to happen is, I would say still CBDC is in early stages, right?
Okay.
The government still need to figure out what's the best way it will get used. Will it just be domestic? Will it be floated cross-border? So there is so much work to be done. Maybe an easier form of doing CBDC would be a bank may issue a stable coin a lot more quickly, where it keeps a US dollar reserve or a euro reserve or a GBP reserve and becomes an issuer because they're already holding billions of dollars of cash. And that may just be a more easier way to make a stable coin possible a lot more quickly. Bank already is part of the ecosystem, which essentially a lot of other institutions will be able to use.
So essentially, whatever they hold as an overnight liquidity can technically become a stable coin kind of a situation.
Absolutely.
Fair enough. And look, that could be a very interesting conversation as well. But let's talk regulations, right? How do you see regulations evolving in this space globally? And obviously, you have seen that UAE has taken significant steps in this. Number of consultation papers that have come out in just last few weeks, and number of announcements on regulatory authorities as well. How do you see this space evolving?
Yeah. So there is one fact that's been established: the genie is out of the bottle, right? So there are 300 million crypto users. They are too big, too large a force, too positive, and there is some element of negativity as well in terms of economic force that they can't be ignored, right? So if you look at India, so of course India has not legalized cryptocurrency, and legalization is a more technical term, but they have essentially allowed it through one can pay tax. So they're essentially moving forward. Similarly, most of the countries are essentially saying, hey, how do I regulate this genie rather than put that in the back in the bottle, right? So I think that's where everybody's mindset is, right? So most of them are essentially are issuing taxonomy to say how is crypto A different from crypto B to crypto C. A lot of them are essentially regulating exchanges. A lot of them are just regulating the on and off ramps into a crypto as well, right? So different regulators, different schemes, different ideas. But to my mind, awareness is very high, and everybody is figuring out what's the best way for us to regulate cryptos in their respective jurisdictions. So personally, I'm very hopeful. I think there is hardly any regulator around the world who is essentially saying, hey, you know what, I'm not thinking about this.
Awesome. So what are the key challenges that company like yours, Ripple, today faces in the market?
Yeah. So for us, honestly, key challenge is the sheer opportunity, right? Okay. So there is only 24 hours in a day in which we have to sleep a little bit as well, right? So for us, the key thing is to stay focused, to stay aligned. So we started with payments, and now, for example, we have built a NFT a platform as well. We have put $250 million aside as a creator fund for different artists to essentially come together and build on the top of XRP Ledger, right? And for us, the key is, if we would have had the same conversation 24 months ago, it would have been very hard for us to say, hey, you know what, NFT is going to be a very big thing, right? But it just took off like a sheer force of its own. And for us, the key thing is, as these large mass adoption opportunities come, how do we make sure that we are able to take them on board and deliver value to Bhavan, right? And to our customers and users, so that they are able to use this at scale. So I think that's really the challenge. Challenge is that there is too much opportunity out there. How to pick and choose areas where we are going to make a big play.
Awesome. And Navin, how are you seeing the challenge regarding talent as well? Because one of the things that I see in the market is that too many people claim to know, but very few actually know how crypto works, or even how it is supposed to work in the future. And talent has been a major dearth, I would say, in that particular way. And how are you addressing that challenge?
Yeah. So honestly, there is a huge demand and supply mismatch, right? I mean, it's writing is on the wall, right? So the way we are doing it is in two ways. So one, for example, now we are becoming a flexible company. You can essentially be in Timbuktu, join Ripple, and you can essentially work from there. Or you can work in any of our offices around the world, or of course you can work in our head office, right? So we are flexible. Wherever the talent would be, we will go and we'll come after you in a positive way, and then make sure that you are able to contribute positively to the company. The second thing is that we have almost $50 million that we allocated to something called as UBRI, University Blockchain Research Initiative. So here in UAE, for example, NYU AD, Abu Dhabi is part of our UBRI universities, where we have created blockchain centers of excellence. IIT Bombay is one, IIIT Hyderabad, University of Tokyo. I mean, these are universities with large ecosystems where we are encouraging professors, students to start work on blockchain projects. So for example, there is blockchain projects that are being done on land registration, there is on provenance, on sanitation. So lots of large problems, they're looking at it and then saying, hey, you know what, we have this new set of tools that are available, can we solve it in a lot more creative way? And we are constantly injecting our technical expertise, our mentorship, and our dollars to essentially start up these ecosystems. And that's again creating a large flow of new talent that's coming into the field. And that's just not for Ripple, that's essentially for the industry, but we are constantly leading it because we know as a responsible player in the field, we have a responsibility to do so.
No, awesome. And I think that consciousness of investing in future is important. The problem also is that the current cryptonomy is extremely volatile, and whether we like it or not, each one of us gets tempted to look at immediate quarter, immediate day, immediate returns, and somewhere the focus on the long term gets lost. So it's very nice to know that, you know, somebody like you and Ripple are investing in long term growth of the talent, because that obviously remains very important. One last message, Navin, to our audiences, people who are still thinking whether to invest in crypto or not, people who are young entrepreneurs trying to build their careers in this sector, or even the policymakers, what would be your message to them?
I think my message to them is really don't miss the bus. Exactly the message that I had inside as well, to say this is a turning point in everybody's life where we look back and then say, hey, you know what, that Web3 movement was awesome, and I am lucky to be alive during this time, right? But now that notion itself is not big enough for you, if you're an entrepreneur, to build companies, if you're an investor, to invest in a lot of these companies that are essentially coming around, and if you're regulated, to essentially say, could we change our economy at a plumbing level? Could I take advantage of it and essentially leapfrog the economy versus where I was earlier? And I think it's a bend in the road that none of us, all the three audience that you spoke about, should miss.
Awesome. So that's Navin from Ripple for us. Fantastic, Navin, and amazingly insightful. And I think his message is loud and clear. If you are one of the people who have been just looking at crypto economy from a distance, thinking to go in, not to go in, build a career out of it or not, his message is loud and clear. You have seen enough. Now is the time to jump in. Otherwise, it's too little too late. So on that note, thank you all of you for joining us today.